It's finally time. Final Fantasy spoiler season is here, and it's been kicking off with not only some interesting Final Fantasy cards, but something we didn't entirely anticipate this early on in the spoilers, and that is an impactful, historic, nostalgic reprint. That's right, I'm talking about the fact that we got spoiled on Dark Confidant coming to the Final Fantasy set in the upcoming Magic the Gathering expansion, and this has everybody ablaze with talk, from nostalgia of the fact that the OG Bob is finally back in Type 2 format, all the way to people considering, is the card going to be good enough for Standard? And if you came here for my opinion on that, and that's all you wanted to see from the video, no. Bye-bye. Remember, like, comment, and subscribe. But if we're taking things a little bit more seriously, the discussion needs to go just a little bit further as to how Bob will impact the Standard format and why it may or may not be good right now. In this quick little recap, I just really want to hit upon the points as to why I think that Dark Confidant is not what Standard needs right at this instance, and then kind of shift focus into when Dark Confidant will be good for Standard, and take a look at some of the decks in Standard right this moment that can maybe take advantage of the historic card. And so while all the Mono Black and Boomer Jund fans like myself may be just loving the fact that Dark Confidant is back in a format that they might be able to jam it in regardless of how good or bad it is, the fact of the matter is that looking at the recent regional championship events, Standard is just too fast and too aggressive for Bob. Now, one of the historic weaknesses of the fact that Dark Confidant decks in general have existed and kind of fallen in and out of metagames is the fact that Bob is not good into aggro decks. I mean, straight up printed on the card is the fact that you need to lose life when you reveal the card and put it into your hand, which means that increasing mana curves, especially in Standard, where a lot of your good threats are going to be 3 or 4 mana haymakers like Shieldred the Apocalypse, means that you're going to be dealing yourself a decent amount of damage with Bob. So when you have cards like the Mouse package running around in Standard, this card is going to be less and less effective at keeping yourself alive unless your mana curve is specifically lower to deal with those decks. Now, on the flip side of this, Bob, unlike some of the other versions of this card that have been printed recently in Standard, such as Caustic Bronco or Darkstar Augur, only has 1 toughness. So in general, it's gonna die to shock effects and a lot of incidental combat effects. However, Bob also has the weakness of easily being trampled over, which means that in a format where Monstrous Rage is king, Bob unfortunately looks like the court jester of Standard. So just due to the existence of decks like Is It Prowess at the top of the metagame, even though there are falling numbers in mono red aggro, I don't think that Bob is going to be quite the answer that a lot of these black-based mid-range decks are going to need in that specific matchup. Now, Bob does have one upside, and that is, as I mentioned, if you lower your curve against these decks, Bob will give you an accelerant to your card draw that will potentially find answers to these decks. One of the things that we saw was the Mono Black Demons deck at the recent RCs putting up decent numbers specifically in the Is It Prowess matchup, just due to the amount of low mana costed interaction in the form of hand disruption and spot removal that the deck was packing as a whole. Now, taking turn 2 off to cast Bob and then untapping and playing a Go for the Throat and a Cut Down, or any combination of Anoint with Affliction and 1 mana removal spell, is going to be powerful against a deck that wants to set their turn up with a Quarry Steel Cutter and will leave them somewhat empty boarded and unable to really swing in unless there is a plotted Slickshot show-offs, which means of course you can't tap out to remove the rest of the things on their board. So while Bob does have downsides in that matchup, I can see why keeping it in a main deck might not be the worst thing in the world in those matchups, but like I said, you are at a liability as soon as Trample and Prowess come into the picture, because you are not going to be able to sustain the fact that there's a 6 power trampling thing coming at you on turn 2 or 3, and Bob is only going to eat 1 of that damage and potentially just die without trading. Now, although there are a lot of things working against Dark Confidant's presence in Standard, there are matchups where the Dark Confidant would be a boon for these Black X decks. such decks that will be good against are going to be the grindy matchups and the ones that are more geared towards the control side of things. That means that if you are going to be facing a field that has a rising number of domain decks or Jeskai Control, which won the recent RC in NA, those decks are going to need to answer that Dark Confidant instead of your other threats, or just give you a lot of card advantage that those decks aren't normally going to have access to. Other decks that are going to kind of benefit from having Dark Confidant in their decks, the ones you're going to be facing anyway, are going to be some of the slower decks that may not necessarily have a clean way to answer it early, such as like the Orzhov Pixie decks. Now, bouncing your Dark Confidant when you just play it for 2, bouncing it before you draw cards and everything, so long as it's not advancing your opponent's board state, is gonna kind of equate in this little board stall until you can put something down that's a little bit stronger, and that kind of equates to the same thing as Bob eating a little bit of removal. However, decks like Esper Pixie and stuff that can wind up taking advantage of cards like Temporary Lockdown, that can just get rid of like Deep Cavern Bats and now Dark Confidants in addition to that, may be a little bit harder to deal with. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Dark Confidant is going to be good for every single deck that is a Black X deck. The aforementioned Esper and Orzhov Pixie decks probably don't have space for Dark Confidant in their list. The Orzhov one specifically, even though it is a little bit slower and more control-y kind of feeling, just because Dark Confidant doesn't have a lot of good targets that are good ways to interact with what the package of bounce spells and disruptive interaction is really doing. Yeah, you're still going to be able to draw cards off of that, but you already have cards in your deck that are kind of set up to do that, like Unholy Annex. Now, Unholy Annex in and of itself is going to be a problematic card to run with Dark Confidant because, yeah, it only costs 3 to cast the Annex side, but with Ritual Chamber attached to it, this makes an 8 converted mana cost card, which means if you flip that off of Bob's trigger, you're taking 8 damage to the face, and that might not be the best place to be in Standard when you're facing down Mice and Prowess. But the other black decks that are going to want to take advantage of Dark Confidant are going to be things more like the Rising Orzhov Amalia deck or the Raise the Past deck. Now, this deck is going to be using Amalia Benavides Aguirre in order to have the same kind of effect that Pioneer did. You have a growing threat that eventually blows up the board, although there's no combo specifically to get you there immediately, unless you have a very stocked graveyard with which you raise the past with. Now, currently the deck is using copies of Enduring Innocence, since everything in the deck besides the Innocence itself is going to enter the battlefield and then trigger that to draw some cards, but it only winds up happening once per turn. Now, Dark Confidant fits into this list specifically because it has a bunch of criteria that Bob is going to love to see. The first thing is that the deck gains a ton of life. You're going to have life gain to trigger your Amalia to get that board wipe and potentially a game win when you raise the past everything back. So you're going to be drawing towards your combo pieces, drawing towards your interaction and everything, and Bob's life loss is going to be offset by the creatures you have entering the battlefield naturally, thanks to things like Hinterland Sanctifier gaining you life when they enter. Now, all of these creatures is the second part that Bob loves. They are all really low mana cost. Besides the Enduring Innocence and like maybe a Lauren of the Third Path in the main deck, most of them in the sideboard, these are all going to be 1 and 2 mana cost cards, which means that Bob is never really doming you for more than 1 or 2 damage every single time it triggers. Then the third thing, of course, is the fact that Bob can come back off of Raise the Past. So that means that Bob will be able to enter the battlefield if you just want to have a value Raise the Past, which will then continue to draw you towards other copies of it or the final card you need to kind of combo off with the Orzhov Amalia deck. And then the second deck is going to be that mono black demons deck. Now, I did kind of talk about the anti-synergy that Bob has with Unholy Annex, and even though the deck itself was running potentially sideboard copies of Caustic Bronco, the deck in and of itself could benefit if the metagame shifts towards those more controlling decks, because it did wind up struggling against decks like Domain and Jeskai Control. Having access to Dark Confidant means that unlike Caustic Bronco, which needs you to swing in order to really get the triggers going, Bob can just sit there and not have to attack and not have to expose itself to surprise blockers or a very unfavorable type of situation in a split up situation if your opponent casts that. So you're going to be getting incremental card advantage by just casting it on turn 2, and your opponent needing to use those removal spells they'd much rather save for like your shield or the apocalypse later on down the line. Now, yeah, you are potentially going to be doming yourself for 8, but in matchups like that, your life total isn't as under fire as it is against the aggressive matchups. So that's where I could see maybe Dark Confidant being a sideboard card in those decks specifically, and only entering the main deck if the metagame slows down considerably. Now, as for other applications of Dark Confidant, I personally don't solicit this as good deck advice. This is just my headcanon and the fact that there are a ton of cards in Standard right now that are among some of my favorite cards ever printed in Magic the Gathering, and the fact that, yeah, we're in Final Fantasy, so we're getting a lot of characters that I really enjoyed playing their games of. Not to mention the fact that one of my favorite Final Fantasy of all time, Final Fantasy IV's main character, Cecil, or Cecil, if you want to pronounce it the correct way. I like Cecil. That's how I pronounced it when I was growing up, and it just kind of stuck in my head. But Cecil the Dark Knight plays so well with Dark Confidant. Cecil needs you to lose half your starting life total in order to flip into a 4/4 powerhouse that makes all the rest of your creatures indestructible. So yeah, curving Cecil at 1 into Dark Confidant at 2, and then potentially Unholy Annex on 3 is a very powerful sequence of events that will get you very low on life total. So it's not the greatest against the aggressive metagame right now, but then gets you into range where you can start doing things like putting in the Last Ride to your deck and playing a standard version of Death Shadow, where now your Death Shadow with your attacking Cecil the Paladin is going to be indestructible, and your Dark Confidant can just sit back and safely crew that vehicle while you gain tons of advantage off of it. Of course, like, the nostalgia in me is going to want to not just play that version of the deck, which sounds like halfway decent, but also jam just a bunch of mono black spells that I love, playing Cecil into Dark Confidant, into Unholy Annex or Liliana of the Veil in the Boomer Jun style way, and then potentially going mono black or a light green splash to play Phyrexian Obliterator, because if I lose enough life and I make my Obliterator indestructible, it's going to put my opponent in very difficult situations once I start attacking with that combination, potentially taking 9 damage or needing to sacrifice a bunch of their board in order to do so. I could also then give my attacking creatures indestructible and post-combat use a Bushwhack on my now indestructible Phyrexian Obliterator, so I can wind up clearing the board anyway, even if they decide to take the damage. So that's where, like, I want to call it Timmy, but that's where my Tom mind is at right now, just living in magical fantasy world right there. So yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think that Dark Confidant is going to have an enormous impact on Standard, especially the fact that we have a longer rotation for Standard in general. However, we are going to be having a rotation up and coming, like the end of August, beginning of September, whenever like Edge of Eternities winds up hitting. So we are going to wind up having an earlier rotation before we go to like the end of the year rotations for the Standard format. So there are going to be a bunch of things leaving us. Like, unfortunately, I only have a little bit of time to play Bob and Liliana in Standard before I have to move on to Pioneer and really start jamming things like Smuggler's Copter and a mono black aggro deck with Bob now to gain me all that advantage. I haven't even talked about Pioneer. They're just in general talking about Standard, but Pioneer, I think Bob has a lot more applications, especially now that all the red decks are dying down. And yeah, like red black is Rakdos deck in general is a very powerful deck that would love to see something like Bob. But regardless, Bob may wind up having more of an impact once we get past Final Fantasy into Edge of Eternities and some of these cards wind up rotating. The downside is that the Prowess and the mono red decks don't really have a lot of cards rotating, so it may be a little bit of time before Bob's time in the sun in Standard actually comes out into full bloom. But what do you think? Are you excited enough to jam Dark Confidant in Standard, or are you kind of leaving Bob on the sidelines until things switch up massively? Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about the card, and while you're down there, make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this type of content and talking about some spoilers instead of just what's showing up in the tournament reports. Of course, I would love it if you could just go down below the video or on my channel's main page and click that join button, because you will become one of my members. You'll get gain access to all these awesome member benefits, such as access to my Discord channel, just an ear of mine so you can hear these crazy ideas and I can kind of give you feedback on the decks of your own if you post them over there, as well as getting early access to all of the content that I post on my YouTube posts, as well as all of my videos. So I would appreciate it if you have the money to support to click the join button down below the video or on my main homepage channel to show your devotion. And as always, I'd absolutely love if you could just tap that subscribe button. That way you can stay up to date on all sorts of deck techs, metagame analysis, some spoiler talk, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content from me. See you on the battlefield.